even the smallest primary school we have, half form entry, is a complex small to medium enterprise, with almost £1 million budget. 80% of that being held with the HR, complex buildings, with compliance, the juggling of what we ask our head teachers to do. Head teachers never came into the profession to be administrators, to know whether what HR policy needs to be applied, what health and safety. And I think that complexity is one of the things that we spend a lot of time trying to unpick. What do our senior leaders need to do, and what does the multi-academy need to do? We're very clear that if we don't make it easier, then we're not doing it right, because their focus and the focus of governing bodies, local people who give their time free, is about driving that standards agenda, driving that outcome agenda, and let other people who do it every day deal with things like the estates, the compliance. Yes, they have to be involved in it. They have to make sure that it's seen through, but they don't need to manage it or do some of the organisation. So it's about making things easy. I often say to people, the simpler we make it, the easier it
is. Inspections and budget. But behind every spreadsheet and accountability framework sits a deeper question. Why does this school exist in the first place? Well, in this episode of In My Kitchen, Staffroom Stories, I am joined by Dan Hennessy, Chief Finance and Operations Officer at Pope Francis Catholic Multi-Academy Trust. We will be exploring the purpose behind school leadership and indeed stewardship. With over 25 years of leadership experience across education, government, and major infrastructure programs, Dan works at the intersection of finance, estates governance, and operational leadership in multi-academic trusts. Together, we'll explore why financial leadership in schools is about more than just balancing budgets. We look at how operational decisions shape the culture and mission of schools, the responsibility of stewarding public funding in education, what it means to lead with purpose beyond inspection frameworks, and how school leaders keep the mission of education alive when resources are tight. This episode is a reminder that schools are not just institutions. They are communities built around purpose, stewardship, and service. Welcome. Dan, this afternoon, just before we jumped onto this episode, we've spent a fantastic time talking about some of the changes that schools are going through, and we especially looked at the RAISE wide report that's just come out very recently. Now, I remember just the week before, I was speaking to a school leader who said something very interesting. They said they spend so much time managing compliance and budgets that sometimes they forget to talk about why the school exists in the first place. Dan Hennessy, you have worked across a multitude of challenges, I'm sure, dealing with spreadsheets. What is it, from your perspective, you think schools, need to be focusing on? We're going to be exploring that. First of all, though, tell us a little bit about Dan. Who is Dan, and really, what is it that keeps you up at night?
I'm Dan Hennessy. I'm from Liverpool originally. I worked for Pope Francis. Prior to this, I've worked for Star Academies, David Ross. So I've been in the sector for quite a number of years, done a lot of things. Keeping me up at night, I'm quite lucky in one sense. I'm quite a good sleeper. You know, I do this job for a moral reason. I do it because I want the best outcomes for our children, and I keep that as a focus. And when you do this job and any job, when I talk to school leaders, it's about that moral purpose. The budgets, if I do my job right and my team do their job right, we give school leaders opportunities. We don't constrain them by the finance. Finance can constrain us, but it shouldn't hold us back from achieving our core purpose. And if we do it right, we deliver opportunities to our leaders to be able to use funding in the most creative way to deal with that moral purpose. And everything has to. If you've got a North Star, everything has to have a golden trail back to that North Star, and you have to then be able to get that North Star understood by everybody in the organisation, and they have to be able to then keep that tugging on those strings to actually ensure that we are going back to that core purpose.
I love that. Making sure we have that North Star and doing the right thing. And I think that leads us really well into our 3 discussion segments in today's kitchen. Our first discussion segment, we will be looking at the reality of school leadership today. Dan, let's start with the reality that leaders are facing. We were talking just before about the fact that, there's a lot of changes coming about. So schools today, not only are they navigating financial pressures, operational complexities, a lot of rising expectations. From your perspective as the Chief Financial Operating Officer in a multi-academy trust, what are some of the biggest leadership challenges that schools are facing right now?
I think the biggest leadership one is balancing the books when we've got conflicting priorities. So both the new white paper, the new Ofsted framework, all looks around inclusion and around dealing with specific groups, children with SEND, children who are dealing with extreme poverty in their life. And it's about how we target our budgets, but balance our budgets to be able to make sure that the outcomes for everybody are equal, equitable, and the best they can be. And that means that you've got to think about the granular level of how you help a student with complex needs, to how you help a family who has been dealing with poverty and unlocking, getting those children to school with the right food inside them to be able to receive education in the way that other people do. And that's difficult, and there's difficult decisions you have to make within that. The funding that comes with SEND will often not fund the requirements that child needs, and sometimes you need to make compromises. But those compromises shouldn't go away from the core purpose. The core purpose is the best outcomes. And that's what you have to do, and you have to talk to leaders about how you can give them solutions to deliver that. And those solutions sometimes are something they've not thought about, something they potentially don't like, but they need to be done because the core purpose has to be achieved and has to go back to that core purpose.
and that's one thing to keep in mind for a lot of us. As leaders, we do have lots of challenges. We are always, dealing with a lot of different stakeholders. But at the end of the day, that child and those outcomes are ever so important. From your perspective and from what you've seen, what you deal with, what is it that you think people outside of education often misunderstand about running schools today?
I think I think they miss how complex they are. How they're easily even the smallest primary school we have, half form entry, is a complex small to medium enterprise. With almost £1 million budget. 80% of that being held with the HR, complex buildings, with compliance, the juggling of what we ask our head teachers to do. Head teachers never came into the profession to be administrators, to know whether what HR policy needs to be applied, what health and safety. And I think that complexity is one of the things that we spend a lot of time trying to unpick. What do our senior leaders need to do, and what does the multi-academy need to do? We're very clear that if we don't make it easier, then we're not doing it right. Because, their focus and the focus of governing bodies, local governing bodies, local people who give their time free, is about driving that standards agenda, driving that outcome agenda, and let other people who do it every day deal with things like the estates, the compliance. Yes, they have to be involved in it. They have to make sure that it's seen through, but they don't need to manage it or do some of the organisation. So it's about making things easy. I often say to people, the simpler we make it, the easier it is. Things are made difficult in the sector by people trying to put complex arrangements in, where actually, it's about making it easy for everybody, easy to understand. I don't expect heads to be, health and safety gurus. I expect them to have general common sense and those kinds of things, and spot things that are potential issues. But the finer detail, that's where we would step in, and that's where I think we have to consider the role of a head teacher and the role of senior leaders, because they came in to teach, they came into a vocational to make things better, to help people receive the greatest gift that we can give people, which is knowledge and education. So let them do that, and let them do that well, and give them the framework and structure to do that well, and to deliver that. And where there are gaps, give them money and flex the budget to give them that, to unlock something where there's a blockage. Don't weigh them down with all of these things you have to do, because that just makes the job too complex. And you then look at why are people leaving? Are they leaving because of that? And because it should be easy. It shouldn't be a difficult job.
I remember I was having a conversation with a young person, and they were asking me a really interesting question, and that just literally popped into my mind when you were saying that. And they were like, I wonder if when teachers join, or when people who are in school, when they join, whether they look at their job descriptions again. And when you were just talking right now, that conversation, that it came to mind, because it was such a powerful moment. That it was a young person. At Lockeridge we deal with schools, and we also deal with suppliers of products into schools, and so we get to see both sides. And I've got another story I'll say as well, from the head teacher perspective on this one. But then, I've just thought about when you say that, that's a really interesting point. Is it even them looking at the job description, or maybe the job description is way too amorphous? Like it just develops the way a new policy comes in, and then all of a sudden, your job description has expanded and you have to fit it in somehow, but then without the right fingers pointed in the right way on how to do it, or too much has been added there without the thought of, is there capacity for this expectation?
But it goes back. It goes back a little bit to what you were saying about the moral purpose or the mission. At the end of the day, if your mission then breaks down into a number of touchstones or cornerstones that you have the foundations of what the mission is built upon, any strategy that then comes forward, you have to be able to see those touchstones in the strategy without seeing the strategy. So that's such a critical thing that say you had 15 strategies, because you will have that. You'll have early years, you'll have you'll have deprivation, you'll have SEND. There's just three to name. You'll have illiteracy, you'll have oracy, you'll have all these things. But if they don't deliver your cornerstones or built on the cornerstones that are going to deliver your actual mission, you're not going to get there. So they've got to run through that, and that's the thing that. So if I do so if you take it, let me just unpack that just 1 sec. So if you took a literary strategy, and what part of the literary strategy is you want you want people to read out loud, so you want oracy. Part of that can be as simple as basically saying, part of our strategy for a lesson plan is we're going to ask our children to, right then, I'm going to call the classroom. I'm now going to stop on one of you, and I want you to read the question out. And then going to stop on someone to explain the question. You're asking them to read out loud, which is part of the strategy, but actually you're doing that as part of your craft, and therefore your oracy strategy is coming through just a simple practice. And it's about, when you think about that, how easy that is, then you're not having to think about, we've got to get this priority of getting reading out loud as part of our structure. We've got to do an extra session of reading out loud, but I've only got 20 periods I can ask teachers to work. When am I going to fit that in? Should I do it in assembly? Because you're actually just embedding it as part of your culture, a part of your lesson plan. And that's how easy. I know I keep saying it's easy, but that's what you have to do.
It's easy, but not always simple, right? Easy, but not always simple. Because the putting it into practice, then, as you said, does the culture also, translate through? Is it being communicated? How do you effectively communicate? Then that takes you to another level. As a head teacher, for example, as a leader, are you continually improving on your people management skills, on your communication skills, on your mindset? So that it then translates. So are you growing as a person, and then teaching that as a culture as well? Because then that will translate. So it's easy when but then how do we then put it in place? Can you do all that with all the requirements coming from government? All the changes, for example.
You can get bogged down in it, can't you? And you can see it as overwhelming. But you've got.
How do you then strip it back and simplify? Is it the mission?
I think it's the mission, and how your cornerstones or whatever you call them. It's how you break it back down to that core level, and never lose sight of those things. If you never lose sight of your mission, you'll never lose that ability. But also, talk about it with your teams, because every team has so many skills. Every school, I've never gone into a school and not identified the wealth of knowledge and understanding within that workforce. And they have different ideas, and they're able to say, well, we would do it this way, or we could do it that way. And again, you go back to that thing we were talking about before about sharing.
Sharing and community.
As a it's our civic duty to share with others when something works and it works in our context. Tell other people about it, other people in the sector, because they'll be grappling with the same problem we're grappling with. I guarantee you it. So let's share and let's make sure that we get that to everybody who we can.
Well, that really does help us have a snapshot of an understanding behind the reality of school leadership today. We could easily say, there's a lot going on, but as Dan has just said, simplicity. How can we constantly keep going back to mission, keep going back to your pillars? What is it that makes you you? And this leads us really well to the second segment, where we're going to be looking at stewardship, money, and purpose. Ask any school, ask anyone, parents, schools, leaders, even children, what do schools struggle with? And everybody will say, schools have no money.
Yeah.
So that's the one thing. So this is going to be the interesting one that we'll get to. When people hear the word finance, they probably always refer to spreadsheets and controlling the cost. But in today's schools, financial leadership is also about stewardship of public trust. How do you think the role of financial leadership in protecting the mission of schools play out day to day?
Well, it has to play out in everything you do. People, our parents entrust their children to us, and they entrust our children to us longer sometimes than they have them themselves.
Yeah.
So it's about that bond, and it's all about belonging, really.
Yes.
Both students and parents need to feel that they belong to the community of the school that you create. It's fundamental. I mean, if you look at why students don't attend, it's normally about belonging. It's normally about feeling part of the school community, and how you guide that and how you make parents feel part of that, because it's amazing that the research shows you that the drop off from year 6 of parents linked to the school to by the time you get to year 9 is massive. Well, why is that? Why do we have engagement up to the year of 11, and then by the age of 13 we have parents who are almost disaffected? So why is that? Why do we also have absence rates that are where they are, and why are they 10 times worse where in areas where we have where we have poverty? Why is that? And it's about trying to get those things to make sure that we can unpack them, that we can come up with strategy around them, about how do we get our students to school, how do we get them there on time, what unlocks that? Is it the curriculum? That's a quite a fundamental question. Is it boring? And or and school leaders sometimes and school teachers sometimes don't like that question, but we have to face it. We have to. Children have to feel safe, loved, and in a space that they feel that they're going to get the best. When they're in that set of circumstances, they will thrive.
Yes, yeah.
But you've got to do that in a multi-layered. What a child who's a high-functioning, autistic child will need versus a child who's coming, who's basically delivering brother and sister to school before arriving to school because mum's doing 2 or 3 jobs to keep the wolf from the door. What they need is different things, and we've got to be sophisticated enough as an organisation to deliver both at the same time. So and again, it's easy to say, and it's easy, but I have done my time of walking the corridors, being a senior leader in school before, as part of what I've done. So I understand that link of what what comes across the threshold every day, and how we, different people within the organisation will help to unpack some of those things, will help to to help that greeting at the door, that greeting of how are things at home, do you need this, or a bit of flexibility about the time they arrive, because they do have to go to the primary school before, and that's the walking distance from that primary school of drop off to the school gate is a bit tight, and just that little flexibility around that. It's not lonely expectations by any shape or form, but it's just dealing with context, and that's essential.
I so agree with you. As we were talking, I had a quick look at the absence rates and what was mentioned as well around the disadvantage, and it's actually up since pre-COVID, right? So absence rates is about 6-7% higher than it was, and 100% where there is special education needs, where there is mental health challenges, where you have pupils in unstable housing, you definitely do end up with higher absences. And we all know, in education, where there is persistent absences or where absences are higher, they're less likely to pass their maths and GCSEs. But also, like you say, dropout rates from school will be a lot higher.
Absolutely. The statistics are there for us. We know at Key Stage 1 and 2 that that children from certain backgrounds are less likely to hit the standard mark for SATs. They'll arrive with less oracy. They'll arrive with less ability, and it's about getting all students to catch up and keep up, and that. But you see, there's also this link with attendance. About part of it is just gaps, and how do we deal with gaps? How do we deal with the gaps of somebody who's got 6 or 7% non-attendance? If you think about how you build a curriculum, you teach them something in maths. Well, they need that to be able to do the next thing in maths.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So if they miss that, they're already massively behind. And the things that the children don't communicate, especially boys, and I think it's something that was such a big conversation, and we have to get you back to talk about this, because the points you're raising are powerful. Sometimes schools are very focused on academic without realizing you teach the whole child, and you teach the whole child and their family.
Yeah, absolutely. And my main role within all of this is unlocking that for people. So how are we dealing with that gap? How are we dealing with the students who are arriving late or have poor attendance? How do we engage with them? There was a
punishment, because a lot of schools feel like, behavior points.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This, we have to get the partnership with parents right, so they're with us when we're trying to get students into school, and but then also, and
get them into the conversations. A lot of schools do not like to do that. Get the parents into the conversations. Listen to the parents. It takes a village. When I was being brought up,
that's a great saying. But some of my work in Birmingham, we used to go knock on the door, go and talk to the parents, and then if they were having trouble getting their child to get out of bed, we'd have that conversation with the parent there. We'd try and help model that with the parent. We'd try and help support the parents. It's you could take the Draconian thing. Well, we'll fine you. Well, what benefit does anybody get out of that? The school don't get the money the local authorities do, so there's no benefit to the school.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
alienate the parents who just thinks,
Exactly. You create a them against us mentality.
yeah, and
Uh,
and the child sees conflict, which is the last thing you want a child to see.
exactly.
So it makes, so I was always over, I'm not fining, and the local authority, I had the conversation with Ofsted, you know, you've got to be able to pull the levers, but you've got to do them in the right way to get that bond back, that parent and parental link together. If you get that right, if they trust you, you'll flourish as a school. If you get it wrong, you get,
it's harder to win them back. Yes,
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And it becomes a culture. You know, it becomes a culture of blame. You can see it in some schools where there's a culture of pass the buck. Yeah, you ask head of this or that. You know, a lot of people constantly passing the buck, and parents can sense that. Parents know that there's genuine care. So Dan, a lot of people listening will be saying, "You're the money man. You know, we want to do all this, but we don't have money." What would you say to that?
Well, none of us have enough, but the money is the money.
Very important point. Yes.
So the money is the money. We have to make it work out. We have to do what we can with that money. So, you know, but be realistic. We have to do it within that frame, that envelope.
How we as schools can stay true to our purpose and our mission, and we're looking at our Staffroom series, where we're looking at why this school, in particular, Pope Francis Catholic Multi-Academy Trust, exists beyond Ofsted. Dan was explaining to us about the realities of school leadership, where we looked at, if you're a school leader, you know, we tend to find that there'll be lots of different things calling our attention at any one time. But if we can consistently gravitate back to our North Star and the pillars, you know, that surround that North Star, when new things happen and new decisions have to be made, things become easier, right? No, simpler, not necessarily easier, but simpler, because that's the thing that guides us. And in this segment, we're looking at stewardship, finance, and purpose. And just before the break, we're looking at how school leaders can balance financial stability with staying true to their purpose. And we're looking at some key things that happen, things around how do we make the children have that ABC in school, right? So they can feel that they're accepted, they can feel they belong, and they feel that they're part of the community, because those are the things that will enable a child to thrive. And we're looking at how do we bring our parents into the mix? How do we, you know, where I come from, in my culture, we say it takes a village. How do we get the whole village involved in bringing up their children? So now we are going to look at our third segment, where we look beyond Ofsted. What's the real purpose of school? So Dan, one thing I hear from many school leaders is that accountability frameworks can sometimes dominate the conversation. Last week, I joined a webinar, and on this webinar, there were about 24 head teachers, and there were Key Stage 2 head teachers. And many of them just looked so overwhelmed with the pressures that a lot of Key Stage 2 heads are dealing with around special education needs. There's an explosion of it. But also on the other side of that, resourcing, they're really struggling. You know, we all know there's almost an epidemic of TAs. It's really difficult to keep good TAs in school and to even find them. So how can schools exist in such difficult conditions and still, you know, have something that's much bigger than just inspection outcomes, in your opinion?
That's a great question. I mean, you know, I'm seeing that all the time, balancing, especially at key stage 2, where the money that's coming through for SEND and through the EHCPs is not giving you enough to deliver the what is required on the HCP, and how do you actually deal with that? And that's such a difficult one, you know. So I spend quite a lot of time with head teachers about trying to unpack that and trying to unpack about what does it mean, what does the HCP mean for a child? Is it, you know, none of them ever say one-to-one, but they consider it to be one-to-one because of the needs. But how do we actually do that? And I think you're going back to the right thing. You're at in that particular issue, which is such an issue, and it's such an issue at Key Stage 2 with just the agendas that you ask them to hold. And, you know, when you're looking at a secondary school and you've got 50, 60 staff, it's a lot easier to spread the load. In a small one-form entry primary school where you've got 7 teachers and a few TAs, it's a lot more difficult to deliver all the mix of things you need to do. But what we need to do is we need to look at how do we get the best trained TAs to help in those set of circumstances. How could we deliver different structures? So, you know, can we bring students together? Can they be of different ages to bring them together to give them support? Sometimes outside the classroom, sometimes inside the classroom. Having your TAs is the one area where we've spent a lot of time thinking about what training do we need around our TAs, because TAs massively unlock a classroom and massively unlock, you know, they have the key sometimes to helping a teacher with a group of students, and being able to take that group of students, you know, put them on one table together. That TA will work with a number of them. A number of those students may not even have an EHCP, but they have the same need, or they can be helped within the same need. So bringing them together with the steward, you know, with under one TA in one classroom, or sometimes extracting them. So again, but it's about getting better at it. So sometimes, you know, if you were to take a year 1 and a year 2, or a year 2 and a year 3 out together, because they're actually operating at the same, they're not operating at the chronological age, they're operating at a similar age, and functioning at the same ability. Therefore, you bring them out at the same time and work at the same time with those children. So you're actually taking them out of classrooms to give them specialist support to bring them back up. But it's about catching up to keep up, and making sure that so it's those innovative ways of looking at structure, that, which again is all based on finance, but working with the Senko. We have a director of SEND within our trust, so I will work directly with them, who will work with the Senko, who will then look at those structures, and then we look at, you know, can we afford that structure? If so, how? If not, what other compromises can be made elsewhere to help with that? So it's about the one thing you cannot do, you cannot pick that up and take that somewhere else and expect it to work. It has to be your context. It has to be your context, your students, their needs, and the skills that TA brings, because the skills that TA brings may be, you know, maybe oracy, literacy, but they're not something else. So making sure, and then making sure that us as a trust train everybody well. You know, don't forget training. Don't forget that, you know, the needs are getting more complex. But at the end of the day, you know, dealing with, you know, poor behavior is poor behavior, and you deal with it as such. You don't accept it, but but manage it as an adult. And you know, I'm a dad. You know, and you know, I deal with kids like I deal with my kids, and as long as they know your expectations, and they know they know the boundaries they live within, they respect that. Kids respect boundaries. That's what they do. They absolutely respect that. They know their square. They sit to their square. So, but you see, often it's been, well, that's the teacher's job. Well, it isn't. And again, it goes back to your saying of, it takes a village to raise a child. It's everybody's responsibility. Behavior is everybody's. You set your culture, and your culture is that this is what we expect. If somebody steps outside of that, then the TA has as much right to pull that child as the teacher. And they've got to be confident to do that, and they've got to be trained to do it, because it's not something that they will have come to do. They'll have come to do a bit of literacy strategy, or they'll come to do a bit of maths, or they'll come to do help with a child's dyslexic and they need a different screen. But you're actually then now asking them to take on some of the roles of a teacher and do them well. So you've got to train them to do that. You can't just expect them to pick that up. So that's the way we look at it. And I've had great debates about that very point, about how you match the budget of SEND to the need, and how it doesn't balance, and it never will, but how you actually answer the question at the end of it. And I think that's a real massive live debate. And I think, if I'm honest, that's only going to get worse, because I think you're going to see, I think the new paper will probably see less EHCPs, more children with need coming through, but they won't have EHCPs, and therefore the funding that may follow them may be less, but you'll have more need to deal with. So you've got to get more flight of foot to be able to put the structures in to deal with that. And I see that both at primary and at secondary now, that we've got to get better at delivering support through less resources.
Yeah, that I don't know if you noticed, I was scribbling furiously.
I seem to have lost your vocals.
Oh, I'm here. Yeah, I'm here.
Shall I try what we did before?
Yes, please. Yeah, yes.
Yeah, okay.
There we go.
I can hear you again now.
Yeah, fantastic. I mean, I was scribbling before, Dan. I don't know if you noticed, but such really good points, and I want to catch up with you afterwards and just go through this, because I believe there's a lot of good things there, and there's a couple of head teachers that I think might benefit from, that I've been speaking to last week, that might really benefit from that, if that's okay. But the one thing I wrote down that would be so important, that I haven't heard spoken anyway. So what we do at Lockerise Match, we help schools find the one big change. So what do we mean by one big change? We all know that schools, we have lots of different priorities at any one point, and that in itself is the problem. And then you have lots of different people saying, I've got this product and I've got that product, and matching the two just becomes impossible. So we help schools find what it is that they're aligning with their priority at this point, and then we then find them a seller or an offering or an innovative product, to get in front of them that aligns. But all that happens very quickly online, so you don't have to stop what you're doing. You get a notification, oh, would this be interesting for you? And if you like it, you click a button, and then you get the details. Cut off the noise, and then on the other side, cut off the chasing. But one thing that comes with that is a lot of innovative solutions. And in the world that we live in today, I mean, I was teaching in schools for over 10 years. And a lot of what we were doing before I became a teacher, my mom had been a teacher. So my innovation when I became a teacher, 40 years later from when my mom was a teacher, was a blackboard and chalk had moved to whiteboard and chalk, in 40 years. And unfortunately, the problems and the youth move a lot quicker than that.
Yeah.
But when I read, like, for example, when I read the RAISE report and I look at the way we solve a lot of these problems, it's with the same eyes and the same thinking. But there's a lot of innovative things out there. There's a lot of tools, there's a lot of things, but we don't find out about them. So when I attended this workshop with the head teachers, one of the head teachers said, one of the things that's really helped us is we've put in place a way to monitor what is going on in real time, because we've introduced a system that does that in the classroom, and then we can sit down and we can look at how things are developing. Something we wouldn't be able to do as just us and the school with the resourcing that we have. But I'm not seeing any of this in the white paper. I'm not seeing different way of thinking in the white paper. I'm not seeing innovative solutions around finance and funding, in the white paper. And I'm wondering whether as schools, we sort of are not helping ourselves by finding out about these innovative products, or whether there is just not enough being done for us to find out about them.
I think genuinely, I think there's probably too much.
Yeah.
And you cut, and schools can't see the wood for the
Wood from the
trees,
trees, yeah.
and you'll often get a head going to a head teacher meeting and somebody saying, "Well, I've done this and it's worked great,"
Yeah.
and other schools will adopt it, but I sit back and say, well, hold on a second, what's the impact? Have you documented the impact? How much does it cost? What was the resource? How much did it cost? What resources did it take to implement? And it's that loop, closing that loop, isn't it? That you go through the discovery, you work out what you might need, you implement what you need, but then you feedback and it's that feedback bit that we're really not good at, that we're really just not good at. Because if we get good at that, then we then can go to our colleagues and say, this is great and it does this, this and this. But I had a conversation this morning about the white paper, and I was talking about these experts at hand, I think they're called. Now, that's great. Having a speech and language person at hand is great. But who's going to provide them? Where they're going to provide from? And how do individual schools or trusts get them?
Yes.
And how do we? Do we go and find them? And do we then? But then, if I introduce speech and language into a one-form entry primary and we allocate, how do we know that that's had a positive impact?
Yes. Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Is it in oracy? Is it in their nearest the chronological reading ages? All of these things that I want to know, because for me then to say, well, okay, that 30 grand we've put in and it's spread across 3 schools, so it's 7.5 grand per school, has actually led to more children being near their chronological reading age. And it's that level of, so people say I'm the finance man, but actually I'm more interested in, did I spend that 7,500 well, or did I just spend it? Because I think we're too much of we've just spent it, and we think the outcomes are better, but we don't know.
It's almost as if we think money is the solution. If we had more money, then we wouldn't have problems. Ask the world that. We've never lived in a time where there was so much money as the time that we're living in now, but somehow the problems never end. So there must be more than just it's money.
But go back to your point. I came through an education system that had blackboards and people talking to me at the front of this classroom, and I wrote things down and I had some books. It's not dissimilar to what we do now. At all, apart from, as you say, the whiteboards and since then the whiteboards turned into an interactive board, which is now which is now not used any more than the chalkboard, apart from you can read what's on the board because it's typed in and you can see it and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But the lesson hasn't changed.
Mm.
Now, that takes me back to our conversation before we came online, that if those things aren't changing, if a curriculum isn't meeting the needs of what our young people need and making them excited about, right, I really like to go to science. I really like to go to science because we learn about this and I can see the relatability and I can see what I can do with it.
Yeah.
You know, I've had a varied career and I've done loads of things and I've been dead lucky that I've been able to go from one thing to the next. But if you told me back when I did maths that I needed to be able to use equations because I can work out whether that building will fit on that square footage of land, I would have said, really? Okay, I can see that. But I can absolutely tell you now that if I don't know that, I can't do my job. Yeah. And it's that relatability of, what's the inflation rate? How's that going to affect me? Can I afford my mortgage? Can I afford the food? Can I, but they're all boring things, but we have the best lessons are where the lessons come alive. Yes. and where we're using, different methods, different things, video content, linking with, the other side of the world about what they're doing, how are they dealing with their water shortages? How are they dealing with, this complex, sustainability issue, right? They've got loads of sun, but they haven't got any solar, and we've got not much sun, but we're trying to push solar. How does that make any sense? Why are we not,
asking those deep questions? It's funny, Dan, that you say two things just came to mind very quickly. Last week we had a professor from University of Portsmouth, and he said exactly the same thing. So one thing we were exploring is a lot of us are having immense struggles dealing with Gen Z and Gen A, right? Because they will tell you what they think, and they will not sit still if they don't see the need to. And we box that into they have a lot of special education needs and they have a lot of behavior problems, because that's what we know. And he was, it's interesting point he raised around exactly what you said. At the university, they have done away with lectures completely. They do not have lectures, no lecture halls. They have a new campus in East London. What they're doing is teaching to working standards. Yeah. So they teach a little bit, the students put things in practice, and they bring industry in. So the students can quickly see this is how this works in real life. And it's interesting if we explore that even from the nursery age and primary age, how could we introduce that? So yesterday I was speaking to Louise Hill. She's the founder of Go Henry, the bank. And one of the things she was talking about, she's working with the Ministry of Education to introduce financial literacy from primary school.
Yeah.
Is that something, for example, that would start exciting young people, right? Because they want it to be a way in which the families can actually also take part, right?
Well, I remember we had a school bank and working out how a school bank worked.
Yeah.
But, the work that the other financial advisor, the one that's on the telly, Martin Lewis, has done about that whole piece. Yes. It is all of those things, but it's the practicality of those things that make it come alive. That make people think accountants are very boring and we've got spreadsheets and we do this, that, and the other. But actually, what we do sometimes, a CFO actually can have a really exciting job where you're actually doing loads.
Clearly from this conversation,
I go from working on a school that's being rebuilt from scratch to thinking about literacy policy and all the things in between, and therefore I couldn't ask for a better job because it's so varied. But I'm an accountant. Most people would see me as an accountant if they saw my job title, and and therefore, oh, well, that's a bit boring, isn't it? But it's absolutely not, and it's all of those things about I think we've lost. I do think we've lost an opportunity. We've got tech that is, beyond brilliant, but we don't use it, and we don't use it effectively. So absolutely.
Yeah. It would be interesting to find out a little bit more, but we'll come. We have to bring you back, Dan. We really absolutely must bring you back.
Okay.
Because there is just so many interesting places we could take this conversation. I'm really enjoying it. So if we could maybe just take a quick I really honestly I could speak to you forever. I could just take a little bit of perspective from you, because like Dan, you've said you've worked across a breadth of different schools, but also different industry. And I think that's the richness that is coming from this conversation. So if we maybe just bring it to one thing, what would you say? And this is a really difficult one. Do feel free to opt out. What is success in education actually, from your viewpoint? What does it look like from your perspective, not just from Ofsted and what Ofsted is asking us?
I think you can't get away from the delight that I get when I go to schools and kids have achieved something, whether it's a GCSE, whether it's a bike proficiency, whether it's the joy of achievement is by far and away why I do the job. And you can't get away from that. And we should do everything in our power to do that for everybody. And achievement is different for everybody. It isn't necessarily GCSEs, but if they can get and should get 5 or 7 or 9 or 1, you help them to get that. Yes. If it's their cycling proficiency or life skills to go to the shop to be able to manage their budget, you give them that. But the excitement and joy you see on a child's face when they've done that, or they've had a good lesson and they feel like they've taken something from it, that gives me a tingle down my spine. And that for me is why we do the job.
That's a beautiful way to put it. I remember I was scrambling with my brain, trying to remember who said this, and it was Al Nightingale. And he said, success is the progressive realization of a worthy ideal. So in our case, as educators, or even just people working with young people, it's actually helping them at the start to identify their own success. What would you like? What would, what a lot of the time they might not know this. But a lot of young people, you would be surprised, I would say, I'd like to finish this term happier. And then you can ask the deeper question, what does that feel like for you? What does that look like for you? And it's in doing things like that, we're teaching some very important life skills, and I think, as you said, Dan, that will bring you joy as a teacher beyond just the Ofsted. Yes, we know you have the pressures, especially for high-performing schools. There's a lot of pressure, coming from everybody, coming from your head of department, coming from, your leadership team, around the grades and, pixel scores and, all those kind of things. But how about that young person, right? What's their worthy ideal? And then from that's a beautiful way to end. So 3 takeaways, Dan. So from today's episode, we were looking at financial leadership and in schools, looking at what stewardship means beyond the spreadsheet. We then looked at operational decisions and how they shape culture and how they how we help to sustain the schools. And then we looked at the purpose of schools. We do know there's this big cry or big ask of schools to be bigger, but how about the accountability frameworks? And what we have, the one big change, we could take away from today's episode is mission. Let everything that we do in a school, always point back to, that North Star. And you know what, Dan, just from the conversation of everything you've said, it is clear that you don't just say this, you actually live it. Because everything you've said has constantly gone back to that. It's constantly gone back to that child. Who are they? That child, what you're doing, how are they benefiting? Yes, the numbers are there. Yes, we recognize the pressure is there. But at the end of the day, what is it that you are doing for that child? And I think it's safe to say, Dan, that for you, what would your one big change be for the viewers? Would it be about that vision and what it is, or what words could you choose to use?
If I could change an organization, I have to do it through getting everybody to share the vision. And we don't, no organization has that. But if you get them to have that, you change the world.
Yes.
And that's how important it is.
Fantastic. Change the world by making sure everybody shares that vision. Create space where, as a school, you can talk about why your school exists.
Exactly. You all have a shared purpose. At the end of the day, unfortunately, I do come across people in education who aren't there for the kids. And if you're not, then I don't know why you do the job, because that's what we're here for. It's as simple as that.
100%. So anybody who's watching, whether you're going to be watching this on YouTube, whether it is through, the different various social media channels, we would encourage you to take 30 seconds and type your one big change. What do you feel as a school is your one big change? How can, maybe we all have a part to play in this. You might say, well, the head teacher never creates a space for us to talk. Have you maybe suggested a suggestion box around that? We can all take, some level of accountability, because very rightly, as Dan said, if we exist for the child, what are we doing at the end of every day to ask that question? How do we help this child move forward? So, Dan, the next session is a very exciting one. It's our quick style, rapid fire session, as we call it. Before we go, we always like to end with a quick star of the pod, 7 quick questions that we ask you. And there's only one rule in my kitchen for these questions. And that is, you got to say what comes to mind fast without thinking. Are you ready?
Okay.
Oh, brilliant. So first question, nice and easy. We start gently. Tea or coffee? Something stronger, and how do you take it?
It's definitely coffee, and it's just white. Strong and white.
Strong white. Sugar, no sugar?
No sugar.
No sugar. Okay. Anybody who's enjoyed today's episode, and I'm sure everybody has, know how to buy Dan his coffee. It's a white coffee, and very, very strong. A daily ritual that keeps you grounded?
Believe it or not, I sauna and cold plunge every morning.
What?
Yeah, every morning, 5 degrees.
Oh, wow. I was hearing about somebody that created that the other day. What's his name?
Wim Hof. Yeah, Wim Hof. Yeah, follow his principles. It keeps me extremely zen every morning. Start the day very clear-headed.
Do you go into very, very hot heat?
So the sauna's about 100 and 110, and then straight into cold plunge about 5 degrees.
Oh, that would keep you grounded.
Oh, absolutely. It's great. But it's taken me a long time to stay in there 6 minutes, put it that way. So
in the hot or in the cold?
No, in the cold. 20 minutes in the hot. So that's easy. That's just nice.
Wow. How do you change your state in order for you to do that?
What do you mean?
Like how you must have a way in which you, or maybe you're just so used to it now you just do it. But
you just throw yourself in, and then you have to just regulate your body so your heart comes back to where it should be. So
okay, I've got to ask this one. I know it's supposed to be rapid fire, but do you have a sauna and an ice bath?
I have a sauna in the garden, and I have an old oak barrel in the garden, which I have a chiller on.
I have to come and see that one day if I'm invited to Liverpool.
Absolutely.
Brilliant. I love it. One connection that changed everything for you.
Oh God, some of the chief execs I've worked with some inspirational people. You know, probably meeting Hamid Patel from Star Academies. He taught me so much and gave me an awful lot of takeaways that I've used throughout my career since then. So probably that one probably. Coming into education was just a complete by accident. So, but yeah, no, probably people I've met along the way, I would say.
Oh, wow. Well, in that case, we need to work hard to bring Hamid Patel. We have to meet him too then. He sounds inspirational. A piece of tech that genuinely brings people closer.
I think video calling massively. So be it WhatsApp, be it Teams, be it Facebook, I think the ability to see people and talk to them can unlock everything.
Yeah, I agree. A quote or mantra that you live by?
I like Mandela's about education being a weapon that can change the world. Because it really shows that education is a right. Everybody should have the right to it, regardless of your background. So I do like that one.
Yeah, no, that's a powerful one. Something people would be surprised to know about you.
I have loads of tattoos.
Aha.
But nobody ever sees them because I wear a long sleeve shirt all day, all day. So when people do see them, it really does take people back. Oh, right, okay, I didn't expect you to have tattoos.
No, I have to say, yes, it's a good surprise, I would say. Yeah.
Their arms and legs all covered, so.
Wow. I'm going to ask you that one after. Yeah, I love it. Okay, if this season of your life had a theme song, what would you choose?
It would probably be A Million Dreams, because that's what it's all about.
I love, my son sang that in primary school. I love that song when they had their play. Oh, wow, Dan, thank you so much for bringing your leadership perspective into the kitchen today. Thank you for bringing your deep insights. Thank you for bringing your mindset and for really just helping us think a lot deeper about purpose behind schools. I cannot genuinely, hand on heart, think of anybody more perfect to have been talking about today's topic. And you really do truly live what you believe. It just seeps through every single element of that conversation. And for anybody who is watching this, online at any point, please do feel free to rewind and replay. There's so many golden nuggets, to revisit this conversation, and maybe even share it with your SLT team. We will try and run Dan back in here because he's got so much to share. That the way that we look at purpose, the way that we look at numbers, if we can bring both together, there is a lot of change, genuine good change that we can bring in. And don't forget your one big change, because sometimes the smallest shift in thinking can reconnect a whole school.
Absolutely.
With your mission. Dan, if anybody wanted to connect with you, find you, have a chat with you, where can they find you?
I mean, go onto our website. There's a contact form there, or go onto LinkedIn. You'll find me on LinkedIn. Just drop me a I don't know what it's called. Drop me an invite, and just send me a message. I'm quite open to share. That's what we're here for. If I can help in any way, I will. If I can't help, I might know somebody else who can, and that's the power of being in the space for so long.
Yeah, and as you so genuinely say, to serve. Next Thursday, same time, same kitchen, we'll be diving into another Staffroom story, and we will be bringing Sash Hamidi to the kitchen. He brings a wealth of knowledge, but also a fantastic way to think about how we can approach pastoral services. Until then, stay connected, stay human, and it's not about doing more, it's about connecting better. Thank you so much, and bye for now.